Thank you very much for coming to this conference. I will be serving as a moderator for session 1. I am with the Nikkei. My name is Fujii. For this session 1, thinking about the connectivity of European and Indo-Pacific security. So Russia, China, Europe, United States. We have the experts on these the regions and countries here with us. We have illustrious panel for this session. As was mentioned by Mr. Kato, President Putin recently visited North Korea, and comprehensive partnership treaty has been concluded, which has made a big news. And in the European Parliament election recently, it seems that the rightist group have seen a great progress, and that may have much relevance to the strategy of the European Union going forward. And there will be the first debate for the presidential candidates on the 27th of this month. And even though this is a global election year, the biggest election where people are keenly interested in is, of course, the presidential election in the United States. So inclusive of all these topics, I hope that we will be able to see a good discussion by the panelists. I will not explain the background of the panelists because you have already the program with you, and all of them are quite well known and the leading experts in their area. And for the first round, I would like to ask each panelist to speak for 5 minutes. The first panelist is the ambassador, former ambassador to Russia, Professor McFall from Stanford University will be the first speaker. I would like to ask him to speak about the Ukrainian war because it is so prolonged, and what may be the prospects going forward, and what would be the possible endgame for this war. Inclusive of that, please. So, Professor McFall, please.
First of all, thank you for having me here. I think this is on? Yep.
Yes.
I can speak without it. I have a loud voice. I'm a professor, so I know how to speak without microphones. It's a great honor to be here. Couldn't be a more important time. When Mr. Putin went to North Korea, I just happened to be in South Korea before he came. That is a coincidence, but it also, I think, signals something very important about the broader topic. And I couldn't hear in the interpretation. You're allowing me to speak for 50 minutes, right? Not 5 minutes? I heard 50 minutes. I didn't hear 5 minutes. It's very hard for me to speak in 5-minute intervals, but let me just try to make 3 brief points. The first is Mr. Putin's trip to North Korea, which was a historic moment, underscores very clearly, I hope for all, that European security and Asian security are intertwined. There are some in my country, I don't know what the debates are here, but there are some in my country that says, we don't care about Ukraine. Everything is about China. And we should not be focused on security in Europe. But Mr. Putin doesn't think that. I'll let Ariana and others speak about what Xi Jinping thinks, but my reading of him is that he doesn't think that. And what instead I see, tragically, I want to emphasize this is tragically, I see the breakdown of what you called the liberal international order. And instead, we're going back to an earlier period where there were not one order, but 2 and maybe many orders. And one of those divisions, not the only division, but one of those divisions are between autocrats and democrats. And the autocrats are organized among themselves and helping each other. The Democrats, and I mean small d Democrats, I'm a proud member of the Democratic Party. I want to make that clear, just so we're not confused. I'm not trying to be analytical about this, but when I use the word Democrat here, I mean small d Democrats or small l liberals. Therefore, we need to be as organized as the autocrats are organized. The second point I would make, good news and bad news about the war in Ukraine. The good news about the war in Ukraine is that I have been mostly impressed with how the liberal free world came together to provide weapons, first and foremost, to provide economic assistance, secondary, including Japan, and to provide, put in place sanctions, including Japan. The free world has responded in the defense of Ukraine. And I want you to know, I speak with Ukrainians pretty much every day. They are deeply grateful for that assistance, that the free world saw that this was an assault on the free world, a dictatorship invading a democracy, an imperial country, trying to recolonize a former colony, and then trying to annex part of that territory. That response has been fantastic. And without that response, the situation in Ukraine would be very, very dire. Mr. Putin and his military would be in downtown Kiev. They would occupy Kharkiv. They would occupy Odessa by now. That without the alliance and the response from the free world, that would have happened. That's the good news. The bad news has been three different things. One, in my view, we didn't respond fast enough. And I would say about my country in particular, had we responded in a faster way, with more weapons and more sanctions, faster, the war might be in a better place. And I understand the fears of escalation. I know the Biden administration well. I used to work with Mr. Biden when he was the vice president. I know his team well. I understand nobody wants a war with Russia, and nobody most certainly wants the use of a nuclear weapon. But because of that fear, we went slower than we should have. We've done all the right things in terms of weapons. We should have done it faster. The second thing, in terms of the bad news, is when it came time to providing new weapons and new assistance, we were delayed by 6 months. And that was, to me, a very painful time. We eventually got the $60 billion package passed, was delayed by 6 months, and that was primarily because of Mr. Trump. And I'll go back and I'll talk about that if you're interested about Trump. My guess is Mr. Trump will come up a lot in our conversation in subsequent questions. So we'll get back to Mr. Trump in a minute. But then the third piece, in terms of me not answering your question directly because it's too hard to answer, is we are now at a very difficult moment because of those delays, that the Russians are now dug in. They're in a defensive posture, and it's very difficult to see a moment of breakthrough on the Ukrainian side in the next 12 months. Instead, they are in a defensive posture for two reasons. One is they think that nothing concrete can be done in terms of negotiations until the world knows who will be the next president of the United States. I don't know the answer to that. If you know the answer, you could make a lot of money right now because there's a lot of people around the world that want to know who will be the next president of the United States. We don't know that. Mr. President Zelensky doesn't know. President Putin doesn't know. They're waiting for that fact. If it's Mr. Trump, things could change very quickly. And we can talk about those scenarios because I see my time has already expired. If it's Mr. Biden, then there will be, in my prediction, one more big counteroffensive push in the spring of 2025 in various ways where the Russians will, the Ukrainians will hopefully put the Russians on the defensive along the traditional places and maybe along some non-traditional places that they're not advertising ahead of time. And that, I think, will be the next critical moment in this tragic, horrific, barbaric war. And you just notice I can't answer your question because President Putin doesn't know the answer to your question. President Zelensky doesn't know. I know President Biden doesn't know. Mr. Trump thinks he knows, but he also doesn't know. And I think we'll have to wait for those two key events before we know what the trajectory will be.
はい、ちょっと難しい質問をしてしまった。
Sorry, I asked
you very, very difficult question, but we don't know either way we go. Maybe we can talk on an assumption basis, though. But next, Dr. Tsuruoka, you are mainly studying Europe, and every day you are appearing on TV regarding Ukraine issue every day. And to Dr. Tsuruoka too, I would like to ask you the same question in terms of the prospect of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What kind of approach can be conceivable? So please give us initial remarks. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. The theme of this session is the connectivity of European and Indo-Pacific security. I myself, relationship between Japan and Europe, relationship between Asia and Europe, this is area of my interest for the past 2 decades. But 20 years ago, nobody took interest in these issues, so I was so alone studying these issues in the past. However, more recently, I have become more busy, and I would prefer less busy than now, but I have become very, very busy compared to 20 years ago. Now, regarding the war, prospect of the war, and what kind of implications does it have on Asia Pacific, including Japan? On these topics, I would like to give you a few points. First of all, regarding the war itself, unfortunately, it is continuing. It will continue, unfortunately. At least Russia is on an advantageous basis now. That means that there is no motivation for Russia to stop war, because the longer Russia engages in war, the more territory the country can get. Therefore, there is little motivation for Russia to stop the war. When we talk about ceasefire, we have to consider how Ukraine should accept, how should we persuade Ukraine to accept ceasefire. But that is the topic we often talk about. However, even before that, there is no intention on the part of Russia for ceasefire. So that is to say, we have to persuade Russia to go for a ceasefire. That is the first step we have to take. And furthermore, simply put, the Ukraine forces can strike back the Russia back home. If that can be done, that would be the end of the war. However, realistically, this is highly difficult. We know that. Then there is another point we have to consider. Even if Ukraine can push back the Russian military, can it lead to the end of the war? Because maybe in the future, if there is an opportunity in the future, Russia may invade Russia once again. And therefore, as we often said, on the 24th of February in 2022, the war started. And therefore, people say that we have to go back to the status on the 22nd of that month. However, we may see the resumption of the war in the future. So that means that we have to change the system completely in order to avoid the war from happening again. Just like Mr. McFaul, I would like to give you good news and bad news. The lessons we learned from this war, there are good news and bad news. Now, there are many, many more good news as compared to bad news. For the defense of NATO members, NATO has been successful. Whatever Putin and Medvedev say, and Baltic countries are not attacked. Poland is not attacked. So in that sense, the NATO countries have been protected. That means that the deterrence of NATO has been functioning well in that sense. Now, Russia underestimated the capability of Ukraine. Therefore, military power, by using military power, it is very difficult to occupy the enemy's territory and snatch that territory. So the people on the ground and people in the Ukraine has significantly resisted such a move from Russia. Therefore, it's highly difficult to grasp the territory by a country. And Professor McFaul said that the unity of Western countries, maybe we all surprised to the extent of unity and solidarity shown by the West. However, there are bad news in terms of shortage of ammunition, and also Russia has strengthened the capability to produce ammunition in the meantime. And also, what is most important is that nuclear state power. How are we going to confront nuclear state power? power state, and the countries with nuclear power try to invade another country or to occupy the country, we have to have a capability to confront such a move. However, in order to avoid nuclear war, we become very prudent and cautious. However, those who are having a nuclear power, can they invade other countries with impunity? Can they get away with it? No, that is not the case. The countries which are surrounded by nuclear power state, I think such a situation or mentality is so appalling. Now, I think there are many lessons we can learn from this conflict, but if I may add one more point before I conclude. As you often say in the US and in Japan, that Russia is a short-term threat and Russia is a declining power. As opposed to that, China is a greater strategic threat and challenge. China is a rising power. So maybe we don't have to think about Russia too much. We can concentrate our attention to China. So this kind of mentality exists in the US and in Japan too. Maybe Asian countries more important. Maybe people think that this is a correct view. However, what is important is maybe Ukraine situation can be inconclusive and the US will pay all the attention to China. Is that good for Asia, or is that good for allies of the US in this region? Depending on the definition, though, in one way or another, Russia may win the war. In such a sense, there will be a greater threat to NATO. Then, in that case, the US have no choice but to pour more resources into Europe. Then, under such a situation, is it possible for the US to concentrate everything into China? So I think we have to consider these possibilities too. If Taiwan contingency actually occurs and that if U.S. is to intervene militarily, the U.S. asset and resources will be concentrated in this region. Then the American posture in Europe will be greatly affected. So in this way, there is a connectivity between Europe and Indo-Pacific in terms of security. We all have to consider all these elements, whether or not we should focus on China or in this region, and what kind of threat would that pose to Asia. This concludes my initial remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tsuruoka. Now, may I invite Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro from Stanford University. She used to be in the Air Force in the United States, and she is studying, and she is an expert on the military security matters in East Asia. So the question I would like to ask, what kind of impact will Ukrainian war have on East Asia? Because you have always pointed to the risks involved of China invading Taiwan with the Ukrainian war. Do you think that the risks has risen because of that?
Well, thank you for that question, and thank you for having me here today. This is my third time in Japan this year. I think that points to the strategic importance of Japan in East Asia, but also Japanese soft power, because I have two little boys who demand that I return to Japan for the Pokemon cards and the Super Sentai swords that I keep buying them and they keep on breaking. I always like to start with something a little light, because my comments, my colleagues gave you some bad news and some good news. I really only have bad news. What I want to do is talk about three areas that I think about very deeply in response to this question of the connectivity, and areas where I don't think we have good answers for. Largely speaking, in all areas of strategy, there are trade-offs, and some of my colleagues have already referred to those trade-offs. I want to hone in on three in particular, that we want to be able to do everything, but we can't. And I, as someone who works on strategy often for the United States, I like to shirk my responsibility and say, my role is to give advice. Senior leaders need to decide where the priorities are. And here are 3 areas that I often think about that I think we need better answers for. And that perhaps the United States and Japan have different answers for that could potentially create some tensions between our 2 countries moving forward as we try to strengthen the alliance. The first one on this question of Taiwan is about the difference between deterrence and provocation. What types of activities deter China? What types of activities provoke China? Ambassador McFall mentioned, for example, that President Biden moved slowly initially for fears of escalation with Russia. That was an assessment about how certain types of activities would cause the Russians perhaps to do things that are worse for us. Now, as a rule, I like to say that you cannot tell the difference between deterrence and provocation based on whether China is unhappy. Because China will be unhappy when they are deterred, and it will be unhappy when they are provoked. The question then is, what type of behavior comes afterwards? Do we take some sort of action? We make some statement together. The United States enhances force posture in Okinawa, whatever it is. Does that lead China to be more cautious? Or does that lead China to be more aggressive? I think that it is very difficult sometimes to determine where that line is. My views on Taiwan are somewhat controversial in that I have something for everybody in the United States to hate. And I think that's largely because my view is that increase of military capabilities deter China, but more political support of Taiwan provokes China. So at least in the United States discussion, you have people who perhaps think the military operations or buildup, these are provocative, and therefore they think I'm more hawkish on this issue, and they might argue instead of military activities, we should promote Taiwan's space in the international order. We should have more visits to Taiwan to make sure they have more international space. But what I think is actually the military activities deter and do not provoke, while the political activities provoke and do not deter. I spend a lot of time talking to Chinese military and party members, and in my discussions with them, at least on that question of Taiwan, I think I'm right on that balance. I just had some meals with PLA last week. I always like to ask them, they hate everything the United States is doing, so I always like to ask, what are the top 3 things you hate the most? So I get a sense of what they're actually focused on. And number 1 is always the political position on Taiwan. Number 2 is the sanctions. And number 3 is our politics with our allies in East Asia. And I'll get to that in a second. So on this deterrence and provocation, I will just say that it leads to big debates within each of our countries. But also historically, this is what can cause alliances to have difficulty coordinating. I am writing a book right now about China and Russia and that alignment. And what I see is even when you have shared threats, if countries have different views about what provokes and what deters, often when one side takes an action that is meant to impose caution that the ally sees as provocative, that can lead to some disagreements. And so in my time here in Japan, one of the questions I've been asking people I meet with is, are there US policies that you think right now provoke China, that we think are deterring China? The second balance that I see has to do with this question of how Ukraine impacts thinking in East Asia. It is often the case that what the United States needs to do to reassure allies and partners is different than what we need to do to deter China. And sometimes those things conflict with each other. I speak Chinese, I do not speak Japanese. I'm a China specialist, I'm not an alliance manager. So I always prioritize the deterring of China. But in many of my interactions with our allies and partners in the region, it seems like some of the things they want to see from the United States, especially after Ukraine, certain types of enhanced capabilities or statements. These are things that I think make it harder for us to deter China. One example I will give with allies and partners is they like to see the United States, that often an enhancement of US capability in certain areas can be more reassuring. I have heard arguments, for example, as China increases their nuclear arsenal, it would be reassuring if the United States also increased its nuclear arsenal. But as a military strategist, I know that that would just be very expensive and would make it harder for the United States to get the conventional means it needs to deter allies and partners. The same thing with presence in closer to China. It is very difficult for the United States to think about moving any assets farther away. The idea is if we left parts of Japan, for example, the Japanese would not be reassured. But it is difficult to defend Japan from Japan. So there's these trade-offs in the perceptions, because I think sometimes what countries should learn from the Ukraine war for East Asia is not what they are learning. And I'll leave you with one example. When I was in Taiwan, polling shows that the fact that the United States did not send troops to Ukraine has made the people of Taiwan think we will not send forces to defend Taiwan. Even though I also thought President Biden was extremely clear about this resource issue, that we are focused on Asia. Also, the people of Taiwan think instead of sending troops, the United States will send weapons like we send weapons to Ukraine, except militarily there is no way to get weapons into Taiwan once the war starts. So you also have these differences in what is the perception and what is the reality. And then the last trade-off I like to highlight is between capabilities and resolve. And there are different aspects to how do demonstrations of capabilities versus resolve enhance deterrence or lead to provocation. When I'm at the Pentagon, I have a couple of things I say often that they particularly don't like. One is, I know when the military tells me it's doing something to signal resolve, it means it's a useless thing to do. That's kind of the catch-all phrase. What is this doing? What is this accomplishing? Oh, it's signaling our resolve. And the Chinese see it in a very similar fashion. I think it's possible that attempts to signal resolve, again, can be much more provocative than attempts to demonstrate capabilities. But with all these discussions, to conclude, it seems that the United States and Japan, at least, have to be on the same page about what is reassuring versus what deters China versus what provokes China, and what is more important, capabilities or resolve. And where's the certainty there? I prefer for the United States to speak softly but carry a big stick, meaning we have a lot of capability but we stop talking about it so much. But in many cases, our allies and partners want us to talk about it more. And so in this trip, it's been very eye-opening to hear some of the Japanese perspectives on these issues. I guess to sum up my argument is how the war in Ukraine impacts East Asia depends on how our allies and partners and potential opponents like China see it. We might want them to think about it in a different way, but it's not up to the United States. Thank you.
いや、ありがとうございました。非常に興味
Thank you very much. Very interesting insights. Thank you. Last speaker, Professor Mori, Dr. Satoru Mori. He is specialized in U.S. diplomatic history. And to Dr. Mori as well, I would like to talk about the China's threat vis-a-vis Taiwan, and also following the Ukraine war, how should we interpret and understand the China's threat vis-a-vis Taiwan? Thank you very much. Yes, the Ukraine's invasion by Russia and what kind of threat is being caused to Taiwan following that war. Right after the invasion, the risk of Taiwan contingency by China has increased, relatively speaking. In 2020, there has been some surveys, and about 70 to 80% of respondents said that people are afraid of invasion risk, according to the surveys. Then, more concretely, what kind of threats, what are we afraid of? The unilateral change of status quo. That is the fear. And there has been two forms. One is a military invasion, and the other one is a coercion. People sometimes say gray zone conflict. There are two types of unilateral change of status quo by force. So this is the interpretation. Now, for each of these, what is problem? Let me briefly introduce the problems. Now, with regard to military invasion, the concerns like this has risen very much, particularly those who are studying China in Japan. The established theory is that now or later we will not have an outright invasion of China into Taiwan up to 2030. So during this period, up to 2030, outright invasion does not occur, less likely. I think this has become a more or less established prospect. There are several reasons for this. One is there is not yet military capability to carry out outright invasion. And also, secondly, President Xi Jinping, he doesn't want to risk his regime security to go to war in Taiwan. So, and third point is that for the past 1 year or so, the economic situation is not very favorable for China. It's not best timing for China to invade Taiwan. So these are the reasons. Having said that, personally speaking, my view is that all of these reasons, I think there is lack of transparency when it comes to decisions to be made by authoritarian leader, and therefore maybe that leader may make a decision suboptimal, not optimal decision. So if you consider this possibility, these are only hypothesis or the assumption or educated guess, I would say. So this is only assumption, and therefore we shouldn't talk about this as a self-evident fact, because if there is a preconception like this, that would lead to a surprise attack. So maybe we shouldn't go for too much of a historical analogy. When there was a Pearl Harbor attack in the U.S., people thought that Japan would never attack the U.S. Because Japan would lose, definitely. Therefore, this is a self-evident. Therefore, Japan will not attack the U.S. And secondly, if there is an attack, then it would be an attack on the Philippines, not the U.S. territory. And thirdly, there is always a misinformation. There was a misinformation of attack, and there could be a fatigue to follow, and people wouldn't believe what's happening. I think if we take analogy from the Chinese action now, President Xi Jinping do not want to risk the stability of his regime by going to war in Taiwan. I think this is quite similar to the view prevailed in the United States regarding the Pearl Harbor. And also, there is a scenario to attack outlying islands of Taiwan rather than Taiwan mainland. And this is a parallel here. Now, China's coercive actions, it is the invasion by airplane, for example. I think this is a political tool to express their views. China wants to show that country is protesting to that U.S. action. However, this is similar to a military action. Now, when we consider all this, but that said, I am not saying that there will be another Pearl Harbor. However, this is only assumption, and we should not consider this as a fact, because there are always risks involved in assumption or hypothesis. Therefore, as Orion mentioned earlier, the deterrence, there are various initiatives for deterrence. I don't have time, so I can't go into details, but I think this is an important challenge. And Japan and US have been cooperating to increase deterrence. Second point is about coercion. And so far, we tended to focus on outright invasion. However, there is a way to change the status quo without going to military action. And this possibility is now attracting more attention. There are diverse ways, military, economic, and information-based coercion. And we can say that we cannot maintain the status quo forever. And in this way, China can resort to pressure strategy and to coerce Taiwan. So I think this is a possible approach. American Enterprise Institute, Mr. Blumenthal put together a report, and in that report, there is a detailed description for the past 4 years in many ways that China has been coercing Taiwan, and between Taiwan and China, there was a scenario where the committee is to be established between Taiwan and China for reintegration. Therefore, there could be various coercive actions in order to make Taiwan give up on independence. And however, we don't have any clear scenario for that. Counter-coercion strategy has not been founded or established in a clear way. So we have to do something about this. If this makes move forward and there could be a change of status quo without going to war. And Mr. McFaul said that NATO membership has expanded because of the Russian invasion. However, in the case of China, China knows that if China punches on the desk more strongly, there could be a more reaction. Therefore, China is trying to change the status quo without inviting protest or reaction or resistance from other countries. Therefore, what kind of approaches could we take to confront such approaches on the part of China? Now, I have been discussing this issue in various fora. For example, when we talk about counter-coercion, what could we do? There are some scenarios. Taiwan can be invited to RIMPAC and other military exercises and so forth, and also China's coercive activities. Regarding this, we have to disclose the information we collect regarding the China's coercion to make people know. And also, U.S. forces have to raise presence in the Pacific, and also we have to increase space in international community for Taiwan's diplomacy. And HDR, humanitarian disaster and rescue activities, and the regional countries can work with Taiwan in order to realize access to Taiwan so we can carry out trainings and exercises. And we can do this in proportion to China's coercive activities. And we can step up such approaches. And if China reduces its coercion, then we can scale down such training and exercises. So I think these are the risks we have to face under the current situation. Thank you.
はい、森先生ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Professor Mori. The Taiwan issue, this alone would perhaps merit 1 hour, more than 1 hour discussion. But today we are to speak about Indo-Pacific security and European security, how they are interconnected. So in the second round, once again, I would like to raise a question. Now I would like to turn to Dr. Oriana Mastro. More recently, President Putin visited North Korea. A new partnership has been agreed. Then, how does China observe these moves? The Ukrainian war and the connectivity with Asia, how do you regard this issue? And if you could respond to the questions raised by Professor Mori earlier on Taiwan, please, as well.
Well, thank you for that. I realized as I was making my previous comments that I failed to mention that I had a book that came out last week. I'm very, very bad at publicity. Called Upstart: How China Became a Great Power, that looks at China's strategies towards competition. And this is very relevant to your question because in my research in that book, what I try to do is look at the conditions under which China emulates U.S. approaches. So they take the same strategy in the same areas. When they exploit gaps in the international order or in U.S. policy, so they adopt U.S. strategy, but in new areas. And then lastly, where they've been particularly effective at building power is in entrepreneurial actions, where they do completely different strategies, sometimes in new areas of competition. And when you ask that question, it makes me think, I don't like to say that we underestimate the China threat or overestimate it, but we often mischaracterize it. And one of the reasons we mischaracterize it is we assume kind of that China will act like us in some ways. So if you take the situation with Putin's visit to North Korea, in the United States, there's a discussion of this closeness of autocrats. But the Chinese, their response to that meeting was almost comical, right? They were like, we have nothing to do with this. We are not involved at all. We are not supportive of this at all. And that's largely, I think, for a number of reasons, but one of which is that China has certain views of what types of activities go against their interests. For example, they do believe that traditional alliances is not the best way to pursue their own interests. They think that foreign military intervention, direct intervention in conflicts is very problematic, that arms sales are not going to buy them a lot of power and influence, largely because they can't compete with the United States. All of this, if you understand how China sees their own interests, then their policies make much more sense, right? We might look at their support for Russia and Ukraine and say, well, they are selling stuff to Russia, but for the Chinese, the fact that it's not finished sort of directly, offensive weapons is a big distinction between what they are doing and what the United States does. They don't have these traditional alliances. The only alliance they do have is with North Korea, and that's more the result of history. But that's because they don't want to alienate U.S. partners and allies. And that has been the number one focus of their rise, is to make sure that they didn't alienate Europe, and in particular Europe and Japan the most. And so when you look at the North Korea scenario, we might think, these are all these autocracies, they all have similar interests, they all want the same things. But China is trying to balance between their desire to not alienate the liberal, lowercase l, lowercase d, at the same time of pursuing their own interests, because China is not anti-democracy. China is really regime agnostic. When you look at many of their policies for preferential trade agreements, to selling of AI equipment, to how they react to elections, there's in many cases no difference between democracies and autocracies. And when democratic leaders are elected, the Chinese usually say, the will of the people have spoken, best of luck in your endeavors. So China wants the good of being associated in some cases with Russia, and the good is helping them build up their own capabilities to challenge the United States and Asia, and they're trying to avoid the bad. And so I would say, for a policy recommendation, we have to stop letting them avoid the bad. Whether China and Russia and North Korea are a bloc, I don't think they are, but we should treat them that way, because then maybe the Chinese would reconsider the value of those alignments given the costs that they face, if there are indeed costs with their relationship with the rest of the world.
ありがとうございます。それでは次。
Thank you very much, Dr. Tsuruoka. I would like to ask you the question. The Ukraine war, what is the prospect of the war? And also particularly in Europe, there will be NATO leaders summit in July. And going forward, Europe's Asia-Pacific strategy, the EU is seeking a new framework for security with Japan, according to Nikkei newspaper this morning. So please talk about the relationship between Europe and Japan as well. NATO in 2022 strategic concept was published. The uppermost concept paper. At that time, for the first time, it identified their concerns regarding the various challenges by China. Having said that, in this strategic concept, the concerns about China have been written into that, and also in that NATO is going to take action in Indo-Pacific with China in mind. No, there is a gap between the two, actually. Although concerns have been written into the strategic concept, that is true. However, concrete actions to be taken are not formulated or that reached consensus among NATO members, in my view. However, interestingly, this is a strategic concept in 2022. I read it once again very closely, and China's nuclear strategy, nuclear capabilities are becoming more and more modernized, and NATO has a concern about this. What we have to think about in this case, that NATO's nuclear deterrence, of course, it is focused on mainly on Russia, but is it only Russia? The nuclear deterrence target is only on Russia? I don't think so. In terms of capabilities, China's nuclear missiles, and also platforms and launch pads, and the European countries are closer to China compared to the U.S. But that doesn't mean that there is a greater likelihood of China attacking the Europe. However, when it comes to nuclear capability, China is closer to Europe compared to the U.S. Therefore, Europe has to consider very well how to deter China regarding nuclear capability as well. The NATO, of course, is interested in Indo and Pacific. However, what is being done physically, I think the European main countries are taking the lead. Britain, France, in 2021, carrier Queen Elizabeth was dispatched to Indo-Pacific, and once again next year, the airstrike group will come to this region. France as well, Charles de Gaulle and the carrier strike group will come to Pacific region. And Japan, Italy, and the UK are launching a new next generation fighter project. And also Germany is considering the dispatch of the fighters to this region as well. In this way, the various countries of NATO are pouring more assets into this region, and these countries with military capability and assets to be used are leading the NATO move. And therefore, when it comes to military deployment, I think these NATO leaders take the lead and become conspicuous. In the 9th, 10th, and 11th NATO Leaders Summit will be held in Washington, D.C. in July. And once again, there will be a contact with China. And also in 2023, Madrid, and 2024, Washington. And for 3 years in a row, AP4, including Japan, US, Korea, and New Zealand. And therefore, Leaders Summit will be held. And Prime Minister Kishida is set to participate in this meeting as well. What is important from the perspective of Japan, in the context of NATO, when you consider security, of course, Russia becomes the central topic. However, in the world, there is not only Russia, but also Indo-Pacific region, which is important to European countries as well. And we have to give an input on the importance of Indo-Pacific to NATO leaders, and so that NATO can consider Indo-Pacific region as its own concern as well. one more point, the cooperation between Russia and China, cooperation between North Korea and Russia, they are entering into that new phase now. So Indo-Pacific and Europe, in a very negative sense, are being connected as a new reality. And this can be discussed in the NATO summit. And I think such a discussion can take place between NATO and Asian allies.
コール先生に
Thank you very much, Professor Tsuruoka. May I now turn to Ambassador McFall? As Professor Tsuruoka has mentioned, after the Ukrainian war has erupted, Russia is coming closer to China and now coming closer to North Korea. You are a Russian expert, so looking at Putin, what kind of approach will Putin continue to make vis-a-vis Asia-Pacific going forward? Please.
So great comments. I'd like to comment on lots of things, but let me just take your question instead. I think Ariana said something very important, that the difference between Russia and China, or I would say the difference between Putin and Xi Jinping, because I don't know what the Chinese people think, and I know a little bit about the Russian people think, and they don't always think like their leader does. But there's a big difference when it comes to the main title of our session, the liberal international order, right? Go back in history for a little bit. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the leadership in Moscow wanted to join the liberal international order. They wanted to join all the clubs. They wanted to create markets and build democracy inside Russia. That was real. And there's a lot of revisionist history in my country today that say it wasn't real. I disagree with that. I think it was real. When Putin came into power, he wanted to forget about the liberal part. You know, no more talking about democracy. He made that very clear from the beginning. But he still wanted to build markets. He still wanted American companies to invest there. When I was the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, we signed, not we, but ExxonMobil and Rosneft signed the largest joint venture in the history of capitalism, $500 billion deal. So he was still part of that. He still wanted to be part of that. And then it was like it was an a la carte menu when it came to the other pieces of the liberal international order. But on non-proliferation, I sat in meetings with Mr. Putin and before him, President Medvedev, where we talked about U.S.-Russia collaboration to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, to slow down the nuclear weapons program of North Korea. Now, and on Iran, by the way, we made real achievements. Tragically, Mr. Trump moved away from that deal, but that was a deal, the Iran nuclear deal, that could not have been done without Putin's cooperation. And our efforts on North Korea were not as successful, but I can tell you, I sat with senior Russian officials when we laughed at how crazy Kim Jong-un was and how we had to collaborate together to stop him. Fast forward to today. After, I think it started with 2014, when Putin invaded Ukraine the first time. But then it really accelerated in 2022, where he has made very clear he doesn't want any more liberal international order. He wants the destruction of the liberal international order. And he wants to go back to some 19th century thing where it's just great powers that matter and there are no rules of the game, there are no treaties. That's the world he wants to go back to. And he made that very clear last week in what he did with Kim Jong-un, where he said, to hell with this liberal international order, we don't care. And he's doing the same, by the way, with Iran. He wants to pull the Chinese into that destruction. As one Russian said to me, we'll be the icebreaker. We'll break the ice of the liberal international order, and then China can come roaring through where we've done all the dirty work. But it doesn't strike me that Xi Jinping wants to go along with that. And you can look at this as half glass, half full, and we have this debate in the United States all the time. But Xi Jinping didn't say, go for it, Mr. Putin, take as much Ukraine as you can. He didn't say that. He didn't vote with the Russians in the UN General Assembly. He's made very clear we're not giving lethal assistance. We'll see how long that lasts. And therefore, Putin has not convinced the Chinese yet to go along with us. And I think that, go along with them. And I think that's an important lesson for us to think about how we should treat China vis-a-vis what I think is this chaotic leader of the world illiberal destruction order that is Vladimir Putin. And be very careful that we do not allow his destructive impulses to play a role here in this part of the world. The other thing I wanted to say in the passing, just listening to comments that I meant to say in the beginning about provocation versus deterrence. I thought that was a very interesting dichotomy. And I don't know enough about China or Japan or Korea or this part of the world to say whether these lessons are appropriate or not for Asia. But a very clear lesson, I think, from the last 30 years of European security is the following. We didn't do a lot of things in terms of security in Europe because we worried that doing this or that or the other thing would provoke the bear, right? Would provoke Russia. And one of the things we didn't do is we did not expand NATO to Ukraine. Putin wants you to believe this myth that this was happening and it was just a matter of time, and so his back was against the wall and he had to invade Ukraine to stop the expansion of NATO. I would just remind you that his invasion of Ukraine actually expanded NATO in two places, and he is pulling Russian soldiers off of the border with Finland right now. So this notion that he had to invade to stop that, I think, is complete myth. And I think we should learn that. In retrospect, we were so worried about provocation that we did not do enough deterrence. I left the government right after Putin, right before, I want to be clear about that. The day Putin invaded Ukraine was the day I left Moscow as the US ambassador. So he waited until I left before he invaded, okay? That's a joke if you can't get that in translation. At that moment, we should have prepared for 2022. Maybe NATO membership was too hard because we didn't have enough support, but we most certainly should have sent Stingers and Javelins and ATACMS and HIMARS and F-16s, all of these weapon systems that we're doing now in response. Imagine had we done that starting in 2014. Maybe we could have deterred Putin from invading in 2022. I don't know for sure, but most certainly because we were worried about provocative things, we didn't do that. And now Ukrainians, first and foremost, are paying tragically with their lives because we were so worried about provoking Putin, and I think we should think about that vis-a-vis the balance of power in this part of the world.
先生ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much, Professor McFall. The Xi Jinping and Putin, the difference between the two leaders, and also deterrence. Thank you very much for talking about the lessons we learned in this regard. Professor Mori, regarding Indo-Pacific, the security risks in this region, what kind of lessons could we learn from Ukraine crisis this time? The Professor McFall's remarks can be used as the basis for your remarks too. Thank you very much. There have been several points that I would like to refer to, the points that have been raised in the previous discussion. First point, the Mastro talked about provocation versus deterrence. This concept, that it is true, as she says, regarding China, diplomatically, the diplomatic status, in this area, China can be provoked if we take action in this area. On the other hand, the military capabilities we can deter. So this is one way of putting things into perspective. And Ambassador McFaul, listening to his remarks, I thought the escalation risk has to be considered. As that is important. If escalation risk, if we consider we should not take escalation risks, I think the proportion between deterrence and provocation could differ, and therefore we too much worry about provocation rather than deterrence. Another approach is that the actor that we confront, what is to what extent status quo oriented, and to what extent are they revisionist oriented? In other words, the China, if you think that China is a status quo oriented and therefore deterrence action could be provocation. On the other hand, if China is revisionist oriented, if you think this way, then many actions could be deterrence rather than provocation. Therefore, depending on the analyst, regarding the other side, what kind of assumption do you see? Whether the actor is revisionist oriented or status quo oriented, and then by taking different view, you think different understanding regarding the what could constitute provocation and deterrence. And also connectivity of theaters. Mr. Tsuruoka talked about U.S. Military capabilities allocation between the Europe and Asia. And 3-theater scenario has to be considered. And what could be a target of trade-off? One is to what extent do we allocate forces to which region? And also missile and ammunition allocation. These are the two allocation issues. For the latter, currently, in an accelerated manner between the U.S. and its allies, the cooperative development and manufacturing is sought after. And the other day, we had a new organization dialogue launched, ICAS. Was launched. This is the U.S. and the allies coordinated expansion of missile manufacturing, and by doing this, a trade-off issue can be mitigated to some extent. However, it is quite slow, and also there is no guarantee for long-term investment into military and defense industry. That is a high hurdle. And another one is a deployment in different theaters. Are we going to prioritize Europe or Asia? It is causing a lot of debate now. One way to put an end to this debate is that military balance. We have to also add alliance capabilities so that we can have a total net assessment and to see what is the optimal allocation between different theaters. At the end of the day, this is a political decision, but most likely, needless to say, it doesn't require analysis to say that there is a military imbalance already occurring now. It is true. So from the perspective allocation of capabilities, I think we have to focus more on Indo-Pacific now because there is already imbalance. And the European countries members of NATO, how are they going to build up military capabilities is another issue. In Indo-Pacific region, Japan, Korea, and other countries, including Australia, by increasing their own military capabilities, the U.S. will be able to focus more on the Taiwan defense. Therefore, by these dual focuses, the U.S. will be able to focus more on Taiwan. I think this is going to be an issue we are going to address in the posture allocation in the future. Lastly, what could be used as a reference? That is quite difficult. For one thing, some time ago, just right after the start of the war, what did China learn from this war in Ukraine? That was debated. And how are we going to respond to the lessons learned by China? In other words, I think, broadly speaking, there are 5 points. Perhaps China, looking at Russia's invasion of Ukraine strategically and operationally, I think China will increase the accuracy of strategy and operation. The nuclear is one possibility. And secondly, they have to cut off the external assistance to Taiwan. And also, thirdly, there should be no more Zelensky in Taiwan. That's to say, they have to beat down that leader. And fourth, information control. And also, fifthly, China will spread the narratives advantageous to China. So to these 5 actions to be taken by China, how could we effectively respond to this? And this is what we have to consider in light of the Ukraine war. So using China as a cushion, we have to consider what actions we can take in preparation for Taiwan contingency. And lastly, I think it boils down to deterrence, in my view. Then, in what way, in what concrete way what could we deter? And military invasion of Taiwan has to be avoided, including Senkaku Islands. Invasion have to be avoided, and also status quo change in South China Sea. However, I think there are broadly 3 messages we have to convey to China. One message we have to convey is that I think short, sharp war is not an option. So China has to learn that there is no short, sharp war. And the military asset they consider as their trump card. We can attack and beat down with precision guided missiles, and we have to increase such a capability. And also we have to protracted conflict will not prevail. So we have to make China think that they will prevail in protracted war. That is to say, resilience. We have to comprehensively increase the capability to continue a long-term war. Thirdly, for long-term military build-up, we have to reach a balancing among multilateral countries. And that is the message we have to tell to China. So I think by building up a military capability, they want to win the war without fighting. And we have to show that we have a countervailing capability. We have a countervailing capability on a regional basis through a cooperative military capability increase, so that China's military dominance will deliver, we have to say. And the exit would be armed control. So we have to reach a effective military armed control. I don't think this will come in the near future. I don't know when this can be achieved, but in any case, on that part, we have to deter conflicts. Therefore, at the multinational level, we have to reach balancing. Thank you.
はい、森先生ありがとう。
Thank you very much, Professor Mori. Now, for the remainder of the time, as Ambassador McFall has mentioned at the outset, there will be presidential election in the United States this fall. So rather than predicting the result of that, now in Japan, the very popular jargon or the buzzword is if Trump and when Trump becomes the president. That's the if Trump and when Trump. This phrase seems to be very popular these days in Japan. Now, you could speak about when Biden is re-elected, but basically, if you could speak more about if and when Trump is re-elected. So 2 to 3 minutes each, please. So Ambassador McFall, would you like to start?
I would like to give my time to Ariana. I don't want to speak about this. If Trump is elected is not a question I like to think about. I will be voting for Mr. Biden, who I worked for before. But I do think, let me say 30 seconds on, because everybody wants to talk about what will happen with Trump, for good reason. I will too. But I also I want to underscore there won't just be continuity if Biden wins. You have to remember that most certainly in the war in Ukraine, Putin will do nothing until he knows who the president is. If Biden wins, that's going to change the dynamics in that war for sure. And we haven't talked about it because it's not the theme of our conference today. But I would also say Prime Minister Netanyahu is also waiting to see who the next president is. He thinks he'll have a better chance to negotiate terms of the end of that war with Mr. Trump. That's just an analytic statement. That's not a political statement. I want to be clear about that. And so he's waiting to. And Mr. Putin says the same thing. That's an analytic statement. It's very rational for Putin to want to wait to know who will be the next president of the United States, because if it's Trump, he rightly has calculated that he'll get a better deal if Trump is president than versus Biden. The Biden team know that too. And so especially with regard to those two wars, they think there may be some changes. And by the way, they think that they're not getting any credit for their very, and I agree with them mostly, for their very good policies in this part of the world. Because everybody's distracted with those two other wars. So they hope that in the long run, they'll get more appreciation if they get 4 more years for the good things they have done, including in our bilateral relationship. So that's on the Biden side. But you asked about Trump. I think this is the biggest, most consequential election, most certainly of my lifetime. And scholars of America that I am not think that it's the most consequential election since 1860. And they're mostly focused on what will happen inside America, and we don't have time to talk about that. Although if you want to ask me, I'll do that one more time. But in foreign policy, I want to emphasize a couple of things that I think are pretty obvious, and a third thing that I don't think is obvious. So remember, when Mr. Trump won the election in 2016, he didn't think he was going to win. We know this now. There's a lot of good historical and autobiographies that have been written. He was not planning to win. He was as surprised as much as I was surprised. And so what he did on foreign policy is he called the normal people, including, by the way, some of our colleagues who work at Stanford and the Hoover Institution, to get advice about who he should hire for his foreign policy team. And I know lots of these people. I don't know all of them. I disagree with some of them on their views on policy issues. But these were professional people. They were normal people. That's a bad word. They were people that we would meet with and talk about issues. They could be on this panel right now having discussions with us. Trump didn't like most of these people. Almost all of them he didn't like. Pompeo, maybe he's okay. The rest of them, he's made his views very clear. Secretary Mattis, General Mattis, Google Trump Mattis, you see what he thinks about him. Google Trump McMaster, see what he thinks about him. Those are our colleagues at Stanford, right? And so in Trump 2, none of those people are going to be part of the team. They're not going to be part of the team. Instead, you're going to have people that I would say are, one, less professional, and B, are I need to be diplomatic here, are more loyal to Mr. Trump. How about that? Will do what he wants to do. That's change number 1. Change number 2, Trump didn't understand how the American political foreign policy process worked when he became president. And so a lot of people did a lot of things with respect to national security policy that Trump didn't really watch or pay attention to. There's a very famous story, I don't know if it's true or not, but you've probably all heard about the national security strategy the first national security strategy of Donald Trump, right? The Trump administration. There is a rumor that he's never read that document. You've all read it. I bet you we've all read it. We all know it was a very consequential document, but it's not clear to me that he had anything to do with that. It's not clear to me that he had much to, well, I know for a fact that Trump policies on Russia were oftentimes in tension with Mr. Trump's own personal views. I know that for a fact. Another strange thing. Mr. Trump never showed any interest in promoting democracy abroad. Zero interest. He showed a lot of interest in befriending autocrats, right? Kim Jong-un, Putin, the list is long. Do you know that spending for democracy assistance during the Trump administration went up? The entire time he was president, we spent more on democracy assistance. We expanded the budget from the National Endowment for Democracy, for instance. And you know why? Because Mr. Trump didn't know that. He was not paying attention. This time around, he's paying attention. This time around, he's looked at all these things, and the people around him have looked at all these things. That's very different. And then the third thing I would say, in terms of his, I wrote an article called The Trump Withdrawal Doctrine, right? He doesn't believe in internationalism. He's an isolationist versus engagement person. And in those places, he tried to do things, but he was frustrated by the McMasters and Mattises and the Congress and all that. If he wins election this time, he will think that he has a mandate from the people to do the things that he was frustrating to do before. And on NATO, for instance, he tried to get out of NATO. Now, it won't be easy. We're not a monarchy. We have checks and balances. And if Mr. Trump is elected, I will be on TV every day criticizing him. That'll be part of the process. But this time around, he will think he has a mandate to do those things that he wasn't able to do the first time around, and he'll have a team around him that will want to do that further. So I think it'll be more disruptive, not less disruptive, than the first time around.
すいません。
Thank you very much. We are running short of time, so I apologize. Next, I would like to ask the same question to Dr. Tsuruoka. 2 minutes, please. Thank you very much. So we have to fear Trump in a rightful way. So the alliance for him is a burden, only a burden. Therefore, this is the biggest concern for a country like Japan, which is the U.S. ally. As a result, do we pray for the re-election of Biden? No, I don't think so. Because a re-election of President Biden.
Oh, foreign interference, please. That's a joke. That's a joke.
ですからこれは
So structurally, from the perspective of Japan, the U.S. is becoming more and more inward-looking. So this is a structural issue. In addition to that, already we are seeing the impact. For the past 6 months or so, there was a delay of U.S. assistance to Ukraine, and therefore, if Trump wins the re-election, but that is not the assumption because we are already seeing the impact. We are seeing the effect already. Whoever wins, it doesn't mean that all the problems will be solved and making everybody happy. I don't think so. That wouldn't happen. And also, there's a risk of depending too much on the U.S. Has become more conspicuous, more visible, looking at the assistance to Ukraine as well. If we rely on the U.S. too much because of the division in the Congress, there could be a delay in assistance like this. That means that we have to become more autonomous, more independent. Then what we should answer in terms of the question is that to what extent could we increase the defense budget on our own? And that is one example. And so without depending too much on the U.S., how far are we ready to go? The 2% of GDP, 3% of GDP for the defense budget, and Poland is saying 4% and so forth. Are we ready for this? That is a question we have to ask.
はい。
I
トラ
want
ン
to
プ
say maybe one positive thing before we move on about this. So I agree with everything that's been said about Trump. I would like to add that the people that will be in that administration, I think there will be a lot of retired military as well. Very similar to the first, but different retired military, because these are people that don't have political positions on record. And so they can often be a safe bet. But in many cases, we don't know kind of where are we using loyalist for like the crazies, to that way where those people are, because they haven't been on record to say anything. But from a Chinese perspective, I think the good news is that China will do nothing too aggressive during a Trump administration because they find him extremely unpredictable. Everything I argue about, why there's limitations to U.S. response for certain things has to do with political feasibility. And in many cases, President Trump doesn't care about those things. So on one hand, the good news is, China is not going to use force against Taiwan when President Trump is in office. The bad news goes to this question of provocation versus deterrence. His previous team did many things that I would have considered only provocative on Taiwan, that did not enhance deterrence. And I do worry that some additional actions could be taken that would push China to think that they had to do something, right? U.S. military base in Taiwan, any different statement. There are people I know who are on the conservative side who say Taiwan is basically independent, we should support Taiwan independence. That is a declaration of war. So I think it can go either way, but to the point on U.S.-Japan, I would say maybe the focus should be on trying to ensure that your relationship with the United States helps control those provocative actions. I'm less concerned about I don't know about NATO, but in Asia, Trump cares when countries do not respect us, right? And so the relationship with China is a bit different. Like, we've told China to respect us, and they will not respect what is important to us. And so from the Trump administration perspective, even if they don't care about the alliances, they care about countering China. And so I think the relationship with Japan will remain strong. The question is whether our Japanese friends, Australian friends, South Korean friends can work to control some of those provocative tendencies in the Trump administration.
はい、どうもありがとうございました。それでは最後に
Thank you, Professor Mori. Because we ran over time, so maybe 2 minutes or so. Just one word. Regarding the policy vis-a-vis China, my personal impression is that President look at the China through economic lens. On the other hand, the President's diplomatic and security team would look at China through security lens. Therefore, economically, the tariffs will be raised, and so hawkish, and also diplomatically, in order to protect Taiwan, it will be hawkish against China as well, in any case. However, the biggest concern for me, is that when there was a summit meeting between the China and the U.S., what kind of conversation will take place between Xi Jinping and to Trump? There is no room for negotiation for tariffs, and also there is a room for Taiwan protection. And I think what we are concerned about is the topics they are going to have between Xi Jinping and Trump. And Japan, U.S. are having closer cooperation and dialogue, and therefore other allies as well. We have to try to make that new president understand where our interests rise. And one more point. My source of discontent or dissatisfaction is that at the mind of Trump, I don't think Trump has any country in mind which he wants to protect using American people's resources and military capability. I wonder if he has such a country in mind, whether or not he has such a view of the world, and to what extent could he make a deal with Trump if that is the case? And then if we can't find any deal with Trump, that deterrence will be undermined. And I think this is the concern I have.
ありがとうございました。ちょっと私の
Thank you so much. I apologize that we have gone overboard the time for the session, but I thank all of you for being very kind in answering the diverse questions that I have raised. Thank you very much.